And I'm Brad Smith. Thank you all so much for being here. Each week on Cheddar Climate, we'll shed light on the critical initiatives aimed at addressing the climate crisis. Plus, we'll examine how it's transforming our lives and what we can do to be part of the solution.
That's right. We'll break down a new strategy in Washington embracing this climate fight.
Plus, we'll talk to Justine Calma from The Verge about the Biden administration's decision to end production on the Keystone Pipeline and why it could drastically impact our relationship with our neighbors to the north.
I have so many questions about that. And finally, we'll sit down with the VP of Sustainability at PepsiCo about their pledge to make their entire production chain net zero by 2030.
All right. Big show ahead, and as we continue to think about some of the early stages in this administration, it's worth pointing out that one massive thing that we've continued to watch is the Biden administration continue to roll back some of the Trump administration's efforts to impact climate policy, the Trump administration more detrimentally than the Biden administration. And just to tee up our next guest here a little bit more, there are some movements that we've seen most recently, whether that be in the power of the pen and executive orders, or whether that be with some of the bills that have been proposed, even from the time that Biden has been campaigning all the way leading up to his tenure in the White House, which we're going to get into right now. President Biden has already made a climate change priority here. Breaking from former President Trump's policies, Biden has signed several executive orders reversing moves from the former administration. But the work doesn't end there. Biden still needs to tackle getting legislation through Congress and dealing with some lawmaker pushback. Joining us now is Tim McDonnell, who is the climate and energy reporter at Quartz. Tim, great to have you here with us today, and thanks for taking the time. And just to dive right in the interest of that time, the Trump administration made efforts detrimental to climate change and the environment. What does Biden need to do to prioritize and ultimately move the dial in the opposite direction?
Yeah, thanks so much. It's great to be here. So Biden has already kind of come out of the gate swinging on a number of different initiatives. It's kind of jarring, actually, as a reporter covering this subject, to go from what we saw at the final days of Trump now moving into Biden. And so some of the most important things that we've seen in the last few days, obviously signing an executive order to rejoin the Paris Agreement on climate change. That's going to be basically a huge focus of this administration into the next few months, is coming up with the commitment that the U.S. is going to put forward as part of rejoining the Paris Agreement. And that's going to be a sort of umbrella policy that covers a lot of all the other action that the administration wants to take on climate. And just yesterday, we saw President Biden talk about wanting to convert the entire fleet of vehicles that the federal government owns to electric vehicles. That's going to have a big impact. Tomorrow, there's a few rules coming out with respect to leasing for oil and gas drilling on federal lands. They're going to be putting a pause on that kind of indefinitely. So all these things are really starting to add up. And of course, in the background, President Biden has ordered agencies to go through this long list of about 100 different actions at all different federal agencies that were things that happened under Trump that are now, that sort of relate to climate or the environment or energy, that are now up for review. Many of those are going to eventually be tossed out or replaced with new regulations. So yeah, you talked about the importance of legislation moving forward, and that's going to be part of this equation. The other part is just designing new regulations under existing law, which has its own challenges and also takes time. So in the interim, we're seeing President Biden kind of focus on executive orders at the beginning.
Certainly, and so just mentioning that it takes time, we've already seen this shift from talking about climate change to a climate crisis. And so how long do we anticipate, how much time will it take for some of these policies to prove effective?
Well, I think it remains to be seen how long it will take for them to prove effective. I mean, I think one thing that's very interesting, if just as a kind of historical example, is if you look towards the Obama administration, one of the flagship climate initiatives there obviously was the Clean Power Plan, which was a regulation that the Obama administration came up with to regulate emissions from power plants. And that was something that was ultimately contested by the Trump administration. Trump came up with a replacement for that plan that was much weaker. That ended up being thrown out by the Supreme Court right at the very end of Trump's term. And that's something that Biden is going to have to replace. But I bring this up as an example because despite everything that was happening under Trump, and even though Obama's rule for power plants kind of had problems in the courts, emissions from power plants have been going down consistently year over year, even during Trump. Obviously during coronavirus, that's been happening as well. So I think even just as you start to get the ball rolling on some of these regulations, and the industry, in this case, power plants, but also vehicle manufacturers, airline companies, other big emitters, as they start to see these things on the horizon, they're going to start to make investments at a very early stage to try to anticipate what regulation is going to look like and to try to get ahead of that. We've kind of seen that happen already with power plants, and I think that that's what's going to continue to happen here. But as far as the actual logistics of rolling these regulations out, I mean, this is something that's probably going to take well into Biden's term here to actually push through new regulations for cars, new regulations for power plants, looking at new regulations for methane and other types of emissions that have gone sort of under the radar up to now. So it's going to be a multi-year process for sure. But the idea is that hopefully we get an indication early on about what that's going to look like, and we build the Paris Agreement commitment on the basis of that.
Sure. Tim, I just got to jump in because we're limited on time here. So I want to get a few more questions in. First and foremost, you mentioned cars, EVs. How much are you seeing manufacturers of these vehicles, especially on the electric vehicle trend that we've been watching, and exactly what that can do potentially for an environmental policy, working directly with manufacturers on how both sides of the equation can really meet the task here? Where are you seeing some of those conversations take place? Have they been initiated thus far?
Yeah, well, the U.S. has really been lagging behind on electric vehicle production. U.S. only produces about 20% of the world's electric vehicles. In China, it accounts for about 40%. There's a lot of catch up that has to happen. Tesla and a few other companies have already obviously been making electric vehicles in the U.S. We saw Ford just recently announce that it's going to start production of EVs in the U.S. There are some logistical hurdles as far as the raw materials that are needed for batteries and other reasons why the U.S. has been lagging behind a little bit. But really, the lack of demand has been a big problem here. So, I mean, Biden has not been very clear about what his timeline is for replacing the federal fleet with electric vehicles. But if it's something that actually comes to fruition, we're talking about almost doubling, increasing by almost 50% the number of electric vehicles in total that we have in the U.S. So it would really have a huge impact on demand.
And so, Tim, just lastly here, federal officials are reportedly aiming to free up as much as $10 billion for FEMA to prevent climate disasters. What kind of a difference do you believe that would make? And we only got about 30 seconds here.
It's been a huge problem for FEMA and other disaster response agencies is that, this country is still far too reactive when it comes to natural disasters. We wait for things to go really bad. Huge billion-dollar storms. Last year, 2020, we had a record for billion-dollar disasters in the U.S. And this just keeps happening. We're caught unawares and then have to kind of build back. So the idea with this $10 billion, up to $10 billion that FEMA is talking about, is to try to get ahead of the curve, put in some protections that are going to ultimately help save taxpayers money in the future, since we know that more of these severe disasters are going to continue to happen.
Tim McDonnell, who is the climate and energy reporter at Quartz, joining us today. Thanks so much for the time, Tim. Appreciate the insights. Everyone, coming up, Biden pulls the plug on the Keystone XL Pipeline. But does that mean that it's going for good? We're going to dive into that next. Stick around.
Welcome back to Cheddar Climate, the fight for change. The Keystone XL Pipeline has been one of the biggest environmental controversies in the U.S., and now it appears to be over as President Joe Biden cancels its permit. It's another example of Biden breaking with the Trump administration's climate policies, and it is set to be one of many climate-related priorities during his time in office. Joining us now, Justine Calma, science reporter at The Verge. Justine, welcome. There are so many questions surrounding the Keystone Pipeline, a story that's been in the headlines for years now. What comes next for the pipeline project, and is it gone for good?
Thanks so much for having me. And yes, so what to look forward, we have to look back a little bit. And so in 2015, then President Barack Obama denied a permit to the Keystone XL pipeline, which at the time we thought was sort of the end. And then it wasn't. In 2017, President Trump reversed that order, granting the pipeline a permit so that it could begin construction. And what we saw again last week was Joe Biden making yet another reversal and putting a halt again by revoking that last permit. Now, this is for now seen as essentially killing the project. That day, TC Energy suspended work, and we've now seen reports that workers in Canada who were working along the line, many have already stopped working or are expected to stop working very soon. And so this is a big part of Biden's climate agenda.
Sure.
In terms of meeting his pledge to essentially wean the U.S. off of fossil fuels over the next decade, with a goal of eliminating greenhouse gas emissions by 2050.
Justine, like we mentioned, this is such a complicated subject, and I don't think everyone knows exactly the ins and outs. So very briefly, for some background here, why has the pipeline been such a controversial issue?
Right. So this has been a huge back and forth for more than a decade. I think we should start by listening to some of the concerns that have been raised by Indigenous activists and tribes who were concerned that that this project didn't respect their sovereignty. They said that they weren't adequately consulted. When it comes to this project, free, prior, and informed consent is a right that's outlined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so we saw that the Rosebud Sioux Tribe and the Fort Belknap Indian community filed lawsuits against the Trump administration. They were also joined by environmentalists who were concerned not only about potential leaks that could affect the land and water of these tribes and local communities, but also about climate change. You know, if the U.S. moves forward in taking the dramatic steps necessary to limit climate change to something that's manageable and prevent further climate disasters, how does that align with allowing the construction of a large new pipeline that would bring 830,000 barrels of crude oil each day? And so,
thank you.
Thank you. Yeah,
that was a very. It's a hard, complicated thing. I'm sorry to move you along. There's just so many questions I want to ask. Because we know Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said he was disappointed with Biden's order. We know Canada is an ally of the United States. So what does this mean for international relations, Justine?
Right. So we do know that Trudeau mentioned in his call with Biden last week his disappointment in this, although Canada and the U.S. have been aligned on climate goals when it comes to achieving the benchmark set out in the Paris Agreement, which again requires this elimination of greenhouse gases by 2050 and the reduction of greenhouse gases yearly by nearly 8%, which is actually what we saw during the past year as the pandemic slowed our economies. And so we have to be able to do that intentionally. So that's going to definitely require the U.S. to work with other countries like Canada. We also know that that Trudeau is facing other pressures when it comes to the Trans Mountain Pipeline in Canada as well. And Alberta's premier also expressed disappointment, as did TC Energy, obviously. So it's going to be, we're going to have to watch how things unfold.
We're going to have to watch. We hope you come back because we love talking climate and science here on Cheddar. Justine Calma, science reporter at The Verge. Justine, thank you so much for your insight and time. Coming up, PepsiCo intensifies its goals for going green, how the company plans to hit a double-digit reduction in emissions. That's next.